At 7:14 a.m., the lights inside a federal execution chamber stayed bright. Timothy McVeigh lay strapped down, silent. No apology, no final speech, just a handwritten poem left behind. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Minutes later, he was gone. His body was cremated the same day, the ashes scattered in secret. No grave, no marker, no place for followers to gather. The government didn't just want him dead, they wanted him erased. But that ending only raises a darker question. How does someone go from an anonymous former soldier to forcing the federal government to carry out its first execution in decades? And why, even now, do arguments still rage over whether he was a lone extremist or a pawn in something far bigger? Because to understand why his ashes were hidden, you have to rewind 6 years, to a quiet morning that shattered an entire city. And what happened next changed America forever. April 19th, 1995, started like any other weekday in downtown Oklahoma City. People grabbed coffee, filed paperwork, and dropped their kids off before work. Inside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, elevators chimed, phones rang, and a daycare on the second floor filled with quiet laughter. At 9:02 a.m., everything stopped. A rental truck parked out front erupted in a blast so powerful it ripped the building open like cardboard. The entire north face collapsed in seconds. Concrete slabs pancaked down. Glass exploded outward. Desks, file cabinets, and bodies were hurled through the air. The street outside vanished into a crater nearly 30 feet wide. The shockwave rolled for blocks, shattering windows and knocking people off their feet. Seismographs picked it up miles away. Inside the rubble, 168 people were gone. Office workers, visitors, federal agents, and 19 children who had been dropped off just minutes earlier. Rescue crews rushed in as dust choked the air. Screams came from beneath the wreckage. Toys from the daycare lay buried in broken concrete and twisted steel. It was the deadliest act of domestic terror the country had ever seen. But the most chilling part wasn't the explosion itself. It was the fact that the date had been chosen carefully, and that detail would change how investigators saw everything. April 19th wasn't just another day on the calendar. For Timothy McVeigh, it was a statement. Exactly 2 years earlier, federal tanks had rolled into the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. Flames swallowed the building. Men, women, and children died inside. For many Americans, it was a tragedy. For McVeigh, it became proof that the government had crossed a line it could never uncross. He didn't see Waco as a failure or a mistake. He saw it as an execution. And April 19th was his deadline. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building wasn't chosen for security value or strategic importance. It was chosen for symbolism. A federal presence in the heart of the city, law enforcement offices inside, and, chillingly, a daycare directly above the blast zone. Was that intentional, or just collateral damage in a war he believed he was fighting? McVeigh later claimed the children weren't his target. But investigators questioned how someone who scouted the building for weeks could miss something so obvious. To him, the building represented the enemy, and the timing was meant to send a message, not just to the government, but to anyone watching who shared his rage. This wasn't random violence. It was revenge, carefully scheduled. But revenge like this doesn't happen overnight. Because the bomb that destroyed that building wasn't built in a moment of anger. It was assembled piece by piece over months, and the planning behind it was far more calculated than most people realize.
This wasn't the work of a man snapping. It was the result of months of preparation, patience, and planning. Long before the truck ever rolled into Oklahoma City, Timothy McVeigh and a small circle of associates were quietly gathering supplies. Fertilizer bought in 50-pound bags from farm co-ops across Kansas and Missouri. Cash payments, false names, no paper trail. Storage units became makeshift workshops. Barrels were stacked, wires tested, mixtures refined. The fertilizer was ground down to make it more volatile. Test blasts were set off in remote areas, tweaking the formula until it was powerful enough to do real damage. The final device weighed several tons: ammonium nitrate, racing fuel, diesel, boosters designed to focus the blast forward, turning the truck itself into a weapon. This wasn't guesswork. It was engineering. McVeigh pulled much of his knowledge from military experience and extremist literature. One book in particular kept surfacing in the investigation: The Turner Diaries, a fictional story about overthrowing the government using a truck bomb parked outside a federal building. The similarities were impossible to ignore. As the date approached, roles were divided. One man stayed behind. McVeigh insisted on making the final run alone. Whether that was about trust or wanting full ownership of the act, no one can say for sure. On the night before the bombing, the truck was parked nearby, loaded and ready. McVeigh barely slept. By morning, he put on a shirt bearing a quote about liberty and bloodshed, climbed into the cab, and drove toward downtown Oklahoma City. What happened next was almost worse than the explosion itself, because after lighting the fuses, he simply walked away. And for a brief moment, it looked like he might get away with everything. After parking the truck, Timothy McVeigh didn't run. He locked the doors. Then he walked away at a normal pace, blending into the morning foot traffic. No panic, no hesitation. Inside his jacket, a loaded Glock rested against his chest. In his ears, foam plugs muted what was coming next. 5 minutes later, at 9:02 a.m., the city behind him erupted. The blast tore through the Federal Building as McVeigh was already blocks away. He didn't turn around. He climbed into a beat-up yellow Mercury he'd stashed earlier, started the engine, and drove north out of the city. For a moment, the plan worked. Emergency crews flooded downtown, streets were sealed, confusion reigned. No one knew who had done it or where to look. The man responsible was already miles away, calm and unbothered. But McVeigh made one mistake. The Mercury didn't have a rear license plate. Less than 90 minutes after the explosion, an Oklahoma State trooper noticed the car cruising up Interstate 35. A routine stop. No sirens screaming about terrorism, just a missing plate. When McVeigh stepped out of the car, the trooper spotted a bulge beneath his jacket, a concealed handgun. No permit. He was arrested on the spot. While rescue teams were still pulling bodies from the rubble, the man responsible was sitting alone in a county jail cell, and at that point, no one knew who he really was. But investigators were about to connect the dots, and once they did, the entire case would unravel fast. At first, Timothy McVeigh's arrest barely registered. He wasn't booked as a suspect in the bombing. There were no flashing headlines. Just a routine weapons charge and a quiet jail cell in rural Oklahoma. If one detail had gone differently, he might have been released before investigators ever said his name. But back at the blast site, evidence was already talking.
Among the wreckage, investigators found a twisted piece of metal thrown hundreds of feet from the explosion. A rear axle. Stamped on it was a serial number that survived the blast. That number led straight to a Ryder rental truck in Junction City, Kansas. Paperwork followed fast. The truck had been rented days earlier, paid for in cash, a fake name used. But motel records told a different story. A guest had checked in nearby under his real name. Same build, same face. Witnesses began calling in tips. A man matching the description, military haircut, cold eyes. Composite sketches started to circulate.
Then the storage units were searched. In Kansas, investigators found traces of explosive residue, fertilizer dust, tools, proof that the bomb hadn't been built alone. That's when another name surfaced, Terry Nichols. 2 days after the blast, Nichols heard his name on the news and drove himself to a police station. He claimed innocence, said he knew nothing. But forensic tests told a different story. And then there was Michael Fortier, an old Army friend who knew about the plan in advance, who heard the talk, saw the preparations, and stayed silent until the pressure closed in. What started as a single traffic stop had unraveled an entire network in less than a week. But catching McVeigh was only the beginning, because once the case entered the courtroom, the story shifted again. And the trial would raise questions that still haven't fully gone away. When Timothy McVeigh entered the courtroom, there was no spectacle, no outbursts, no remorse. He sat still, eyes forward, as prosecutors laid out a timeline that felt airtight. The fertilizer purchases, the rental truck, the storage units, the date, the motive. Every step mapped with precision. Survivors took the stand. Some walked with canes. Others carried scars that would never fade. One by one, they described the moment their world collapsed. The jury didn't look away. The prosecution painted McVeigh as a cold, calculating extremist who chose mass death to make a political point. A man who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. The defense took a different angle. They didn't deny the explosion. They reframed the blame. Ruby Ridge, Waco, federal overreach, a government that, in their words, created the monster it now wanted to execute. McVeigh, they argued, wasn't born evil. He was radicalized. But then the case took an unexpected turn. As appeals began, the FBI admitted it had failed to turn over thousands of documents to the defense. Interview notes, lab reports, photographs, materials that should have been disclosed years earlier. The revelation stopped the execution clock cold. Conspiracy theories exploded overnight. What was in those files? Simple oversight? Or something more damaging? Were mistakes covered up, or truths buried? Courts ultimately ruled the missing documents wouldn't have changed the verdict. The conviction stood. The sentence remained. But the damage was done. Doubt had been introduced, and McVeigh leaned into it. Because as the appeals ended, he made a choice that stunned even his own lawyers. He wanted it over, and that decision would define the final chapter of his story. Timothy McVeigh arrived on federal death row with no intention of staying long. Locked inside a concrete cell in Terre Haute, Indiana, he spent 23 hours a day alone. Lights never fully dimmed. Meals slid through a slot. Every movement logged, every word monitored. Instead of fighting, he gave up. One by one, McVeigh dropped his appeals. He told lawyers he didn't want delays, no speeches, no last-minute reversals. To him, execution wasn't an end.
It was a final act of control. On the morning of June 11, 2001, witnesses gathered behind thick glass. Survivors, families of the dead, federal officials. At 7:14 a.m., McVeigh was strapped to a gurney, IV lines in place. He didn't speak. Instead, he left behind a handwritten copy of Invictus, a poem about defiance, about standing unbroken, about being the master of one's fate. Minutes later, it was over.
His body was cremated that same day, the ashes scattered in an undisclosed location, deliberately hidden to prevent a shrine. The federal government's first execution in decades was complete. But the story didn't end there. The bombing reshaped domestic terror laws. Surveillance expanded, security hardened. At the same time, the FBI's admitted missteps fueled decades of suspicion and debate. To some, McVeigh remains a symbol of pure evil. To others, a warning about unchecked radicalization. And to a smaller, darker fringe, a twisted martyr. The victims' families were left without a grave to visit. No closure, just memory. And the question still lingers. Where does responsibility truly begin? With the man who lit the fuse, or with the system that failed to stop him before it burned everything down? Timothy McVeigh blamed the government for everything he became. He pointed to Waco, Ruby Ridge, federal agents with guns and tanks. In his mind, the bombing wasn't a crime, it was a response. The government told a different story. One man, one ideology, one calculated act of mass death meant to terrorize a nation. No excuses, no shared blame. Families of the victims saw it even more clearly. There was no symbol, no message, just empty chairs, stolen futures, and a mourning that never ended. And yet, the unanswered questions refused to disappear. Why were warning signs missed? Why were critical documents withheld for years? And how does rage turn into something powerful enough to justify killing strangers? McVeigh wanted to be remembered as a warning. The government wanted him erased. But history sits somewhere in between, messy, unresolved, and uncomfortable. Because the real danger isn't just one man with a truck and an ideology. It's what happens when fear, grievance, and power collide, and no one steps in before it's too late.